Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have Terry Boddie as tonight's guest speaker. Terry is originally from the island of Nevis. I have an illustration for that. In the Caribbean. He received his BFA from NYU in 1989 and currently teaches there, and an MFA from Hunter College in 1997. Recent exhibitions include Creole Factory at the Parc La Villette in Paris and Infinite Island Contemporary Caribbean Art at the Brooklyn Museum. His work has also been exhibited at the Smithsonian, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Terry has been an artist in residence at the Studio Museum of Harlem, the Center for Book Arts, and the Mary Sharp Walsh Foundation. He has received fellowships from the Center for Photography at Woodstock, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. He also plays an important leadership role in an arts community, serving on the Artist Advisory Committee for the New York Foundation for the Arts and the Artist Advisory Board of NFOCO, an organization we are very good friends with here at SBA. So please help me welcome Terry to our lecture series.
I'd like to maybe just begin by saying that for me, the process of photography is very important because it sort of affords me the opportunity to express myself in ways that sometimes you're not able to vocally. And so for me, it's a very, very important part of my practice. So I just wanted to sort of say that to begin. I'll talk some more about that particular aspect of my work. But I want to begin by showing you, I guess, these images that you've just been looking at for a while. This is the island of Nevis. All right, so Nevis is this island that's a volcanic rock, if you will, in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, about 36 square miles, population about maybe 9,000. So this is where everything began, in a sense, for me, both my creative process and obviously my journey out into the world. So I left the island of Nevis when I was about 15, and so I had some very strong formative foundations and beginnings there that really helped to shape who I became, both as an individual and as an artist later on. Excuse me. And so the reason why I show this image is to sort of set the stage for some of the things that you will see later on. So I came to New York as a teenager, essentially, having left behind this palette that you see on the screen, blue, green, brown, and sort of got transported to New York City, completely different geographical and visual landscape. I started high school in the Bronx. I was almost at the point where I finished high school in the Caribbean. There's a difference in educational systems. But when I came to New York, I went straight to high school, and it was in high school that I started to become exposed to photography. And the type of photography that I was exposed to was traditional black and white photography. And just as importantly, I was exposed to graphic design. So I was sort of beginning those two sort of twin path, if you will, of how to organize an image, how to organize a rectangular space. And very quickly, I fell in love with photography. I think for me, because of its capacity to describe and essentially describe space, objects, people with light and how it impacts them, for me, it was really, really incredible. I started photography, as I said, in high school, but then went to NYU to begin my academic journey, majored at Tisch in photography, and had the opportunity to study with some individuals who really sort of grounded me in this formalist tradition of how to make an image that both speaks to you as a object, but also an image that has sort of historical weight, sometimes even conceptual weight. But for me, it really was about individuals, how those individuals occupy space, how light forms space in individuals when they sort of interact. And so my beginnings was black and white photography. I would take my camera with me. I was your typical walking man with a camera around the city, around the Bronx, Queens. I would randomly just jump on the train and just take a journey and get off and make images. So the images you see were from the very beginning, from maybe the late 1980s to about maybe the mid-1990s. And at this point, I was essentially still exploring the city, exploring my own relationship to the city. One of the difficulties for anyone who's sort of moved from one place to the next is trying to find yourself in this new space that you now occupy. And I had the same challenges. It was maybe different than some, but I think it mirrors a lot of other people's journey in the sense that you had to sort of make something new out of what you encounter. And so for me, it was really using photography as a way to connect to the city, to connect to individuals. But the work sort of changed, it shifted and changed at a certain point right before I graduated NYU. I noticed, and this is essentially something that didn't happen intentionally, but I noticed that there was sometimes like an absence of individuals, at least in a very direct way. Maybe it's their shadow, the sort of trace of an individual who may have just been passing by a particular space that's once again described by light. Or sometimes it's a complete absence of people. And I kind of realized later on that it was sort of my reaction to this idea of absence from my place of being, from my place of origin, if you will. And that work radically changed later on when I went to grad school and became the core of the work that I actually just finished, which I will show you, called The Residue of Memory. One of the last images in this series was this particular image. And that image started to appear in a lot of my subsequent work. And it became almost kind of a representation maybe of myself, but also of other people who are sort of trying to find themselves in the world, if you will, in their wanderings. I started to explore other ways of making images soon after this particular body of work. And one of the forms that it took was exploring Capoeira. So for any of you who have ever seen Capoeira being played, and essentially that's what it's called, play. It's the interaction of two individuals who are having a conversation with their bodies, and the conversation occurs in a circular space which they navigate both horizontally and vertically. And so it's just a beautiful form. Around the time that I encountered Capoeira, I also encountered a different way of making images, quite by accident, I would say. I worked for years at a commercial darkroom, and one day one of my colleagues brought in a bottle of liquid light. How many of you know liquid light, for example, right? So liquid light made its way into the darkroom, and so we started this exploration. It was kind of like a challenge of who could really get the best image rendered with this emulsion that could equal a traditional silver print. So it was 5 of us maybe the first week. There was 3 of us left exploring this material. By the 3rd week, it was essentially just myself And I sort of stuck to it, and I really got it to the point where I started to be able to predict all possibilities of what this particular material can do. And I started to make my own photo paper. And so what you see here are images that are essentially made. They're about 22 by 30, and they are coated with multiple layers of photo emulsion, very selectively, and then exposed in the traditional darkroom, and then dried, and then other media starts to interface with it. And it was one way for me to sort of engage more directly with the process of what I was making. So rather than just sort of making an image with the camera and printing it in a darkroom, now I'm essentially engaged in the very, very foundation of how the object gets made, how the photo paper gets created. And Capoeira was an important part of that, because Capoeira is a very creative art. It's a way for individuals, like I said, to connect, have a conversation with their bodies, with each other, but it's also connected to the continent of Africa. And so I started to research and talk to the capoeiristas and realize that this was a martial art that was essentially the travel across the Atlantic, brought over by enslaved Africans, and then sort of disguised as a martial art by accompanying it with music and chants and song. And for me, that was interesting, the way this camouflage worked. And I started to integrate the image of capoeira with these forms that are themselves retentions of African spiritual systems that were then themselves disguised into religious forms, religious practice, like Santeria, Candomblé, these different sort of practices that Africans would basically create or sustain to sustain themselves. And so the capoeira image became a conversation of their own with these symbols. And for me, it was a way of doing something that went beyond just the image. I was always taught when I was in school that the single image could sort of contain the idea. And I think it did for a very long time. But then I also realized that there's the potential for the image itself to be augmented by other forms, other content. And so capoeira was the beginning of this way of working for me. And so after the capoeira exploration, I started to basically make different types of image. And it came about in an interesting kind of way. So I came to the United States when I was 15, and I didn't go back again until maybe 16 years after that. And that journey had a very profound impact on me. And I like to tell the story of being in the capital of Nevis, Charleston, and having someone who knew me intimately, sort of called me from across the street and started just telling me details of things we used to do as kids. And I had no idea who he was. Absolutely no idea. And I realized that in the process of becoming an expatriate, like my mother in this picture on the left, there are certain things that I had forgotten. I had sort of almost cleared my memory banks of certain information so that I can then acquire other information. And that realization kind of led me on this journey of making these images that I call the residue of memory, because they're about trying to reclaim to a certain degree, but also confront this memory and history that sort of is in flux. And the photographic process is a huge part of that process, because what the photograph is able to do is freeze a moment in time. And that moment, one returns to over and over again and then brings something different to that moment each time they return to it. And so this idea of memory becoming sometimes fluid, flexible, maybe even mythology sometimes is what I'm investigating a lot of times. The images themselves, the iconography for the images that I started to make came from different places. This image, for example, is it's about maybe 30 by 72, so it's a fairly large piece, and it's done with the photo emulsion. And what you see on the left is the ruins of a sugar mill that was the engine that drove the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and I believe elsewhere. And it's basically a giant cane juicer. So you would walk the cane stalks up to that opening that you see and push it inside of this machinery that would then extract the sugar, the juice, which runs to a boiling house. And then the process of making sugar started. The image in the middle, excuse me, is a stamp. It was a series of stamps that the British government, at the time, this was basically in the late 1970s, commemorated to sort of celebrate the great achievement of Europeans in the Caribbean. So it's sort of like a glorified history of the Caribbean. And so one of the things I started to do was to make these images that were almost kind of counter-arguments to that narrative. The image on the right is a partial map of the Caribbean, and there's a face sort of looking out from the Caribbean basin. And so this confluence of iconography, source material that I've actually taken myself on my trips back to the Caribbean, sort of started to come together into this language of reclamation in a sense. And then this is another image. I started to once again acquire different iconography. So my fingerprint from my green card enlarged becomes almost a maze. The writing that you see is a ledger, a plantation ledger from the village where I grew up. And so those names that you see might be, ancestors, but the process of history has sort of, erased that information or that connection. And so this juxtaposition between that ledger, the fingerprint, and then myself as a person about to go out into the world sort of make this conversation. Other images, the iconography grows. I was talking to Jaime earlier today about the school crossing sign, which was very prevalent in the Caribbean. I'm not sure if it's actually there anymore, but it was a very popular Caribbean sign, at least in the Eastern Caribbean where I grew up. And it's sort of an ironic sign, I think, in certain instances, because here these two happy, sort of almost English-looking kids, like running off happily to school in the image on the right, and then what they're kind of leaving behind are these vestiges of their culture in the form of these African language systems that you see sort of juxtaposed in that yellow space. And the iconography, once again, just becomes something that stretches. I think everyone have parents or grandparents who tell them what we would call maybe parables, or this is sayings that they tell you. It's almost like planting seed, just certain things that my grandmother would tell me when I was young that made no sense until I was maybe 30 or 40. All of a sudden one day it made complete sense when she says, pick sense out of nonsense, And I remember telling my son that about 2 months ago when there was something that he didn't want to do because it made no sense to him. And when I told him that, he paused and he kind of looked at me, and I think he got it.
Is the text in the piece all from your grandmother? Is it all?
Yeah, there's things that she would say to me and my siblings growing up. Yeah, sort of just planting these seeds that I think we carry with us, sort of into the world. And actually, those two individuals you see are my sisters in their school uniform, just ready to go out to school. And so the image on the right, if you remember that previous image that you saw, so that work started to come in to these images that I'm making. And as I said, it's sort of like this index for almost everyone who sort of wanders the city, like I said, trying to find themselves. The the congregation, if you will, of the processional individual that you see actually are masqueraders. We call them masqueraders in Nevis, and they come out during carnival and other cultural celebration, and they're kind of a synthesis of both Aboriginal, meaning Arawak and Carib, African and European traditions. European in the sense that the musical instrument that they use is a Scottish drum and fife band form. The peacock feathered headdress is something typical to Aboriginal individuals in the Caribbean, and then the masquerade, obviously, West African tradition. And it's an interesting kind of dynamic where these three cultures that find themselves in the same place create something particular that still is something that happens today. I started to experiment with other objects, other forms. What you see here now is an aerial view of a village from West Africa, from Ghana actually, that's sort of mirrored. And this was a particular period of time when I was trying to create this sort of image that requires very, very minimal content. So something very graphic, something that has weight formally. I always want to invite the viewer to participate in the experience that I'm trying to create. And sometimes that experience could be aesthetic, sometimes it could be, or it could begin as an aesthetic experience, but then slowly start to reveal itself as something else. So you see that same form again, but now it's sort of in a different way, right? The individuals that you see are stilt walkers. The form that's in the middle is actually a building that's been transformed into a mountain. The beauty of liquid light is that it allows you to sort of create these forms and create these shapes, because when you put it onto the surface of the paper and you expose it, put it into the chemical, it's not fixed. It's very malleable. It's almost like Photoshop by hand. We talked earlier that you're able to sort of shift and move and very selectively place the image and the emotion in the place that you want. So the process itself is almost painterly. And it's a different way of thinking. And so here I am making these images, and I think for a while, like my colleagues no longer thought I was a photographer. I was sort of like, doing something else, which was fine because I think at this moment I needed to do something different. And here's another permutation of that form, if you will. And soon after this series began, I discovered Cyanotype. This is, some of you know Cyanotype photographers, historians. 19th century alternative process that essentially created blueprints. And the original form of Cyanotype, actually, the original use of it was by scientists, really, botanists, such as Anna Atkins, who used it to sort of, catalog some of the flora and fauna of Britain in the 19th century. But later on, architects started to use it to create duplicates of architectural drawings. So when I think of cyanotype, it's more than just a blue hue. It has all of these references to systems, to ways of thinking, ways of organizing. This is another image that uses that blue hue. Another image using another aerial view. I'll show you some cyanotype later on that kind of really stretches the meaning of what that word means. And then another image of this individual sort of wandering the space. around this time, I started to use images of the sonogram. At the time my son was born, or before he was born, I sort of acquired this sonogram and started to integrate it into the work, using the sonogram to signify this idea of almost before life, or almost signaling another journey into a different place. It was interesting because I know I was on the right path with this series of work, because when my son was born, when he was about 3, he told me that he was not from here, that he was from like up there. and that kind of set the stage for me to do a different kind of work, and which I will show you some of. The image on the left is a combination of cyanotype and gum bichromate. So I'm continually experimenting and just stretching the limitations of both these images that I'm making, but also the ideas. So the image that you see on the left is actually just that form, and is a galaxy in that negative space that you see. And then a different version of the masqueraders again. And I'm showing you these images because I want to kind of set the stage for some of these current projects that I'm now working on, because my work itself have this trajectory from just doing traditional black and white, making my way through this process where I started to combine these recognizable objects with something that sometimes you're not quite aware of. This image on the left is actually the liquid emulsion on an actual leaf that's then sort of built up in this body with charcoal. So I'm continually experimenting with different processes. The image on the right is an homage to Romeo Baden, one of the people who I greatly admire, sort of like an homage to his image Conjure Woman, just using this particular image of a Caribbean woman as sort of like a mirror of his Conjure Woman, who is this southern roots woman. The sonogram again, the fingerprint that you saw earlier now becomes a sail. This allusion to both birth, pre-birth, after birth, maybe. And then this image, one of the last of the series, is an image of another aerial view mirrored with a housing project on 135th Street in Harlem called Village Project. So this work actually set up the stage for another series of images that I made. And this was the first image of that series, Blueprint. So I started to actually use Blueprint in at least the cyanotype process in a very, very particular way. So I just didn't want to use it as this very attractive blue, wonderful indigo, or shades of indigo color, but I wanted to sort of make it purposeful. So as I said, it was used to make architectural blueprints. So this particular piece refers to that very deliberate process of making ships to take people across the Atlantic, but also the process of creating housing at a certain point in American history to house the descendants of those same people who now are coming from the South to occupy the northern cities. And so they were sort of conveniently shuttled into these structures. And I call this my irreverent American flag. The whips, the bull whips you see are actually made out of cayenne pepper and salt. Cayenne pepper and salt are one of the things that we use, or two of the things that we used in the plantations. After they whipped the slaves, they would rub cayenne pepper and salt into the wound to sort of intensify it. So I said I needed to make a counter narrative to the American flag in this sense. And sometimes as an immigrant, you do feel as if you're a resident alien, right? And I think, so to a certain degree, a lot of these people who first crossed the Atlantic were themselves obviously resident aliens. So this is all part of that blueprint process. The barcode that we scan every time we go to the grocery store now gets superimposed with the slave ship icon, products, both. The plantation ledger with the stock page of the New York Times. And then I started to do installations. And one of the first installations that I did was actually a result actually of nostalgia. So in the Caribbean, during Easter, we would fly kites. Kites was predominant. You go to the Caribbean, any island, any nation during the Easter season, and you see kites dotting the sky. And so I started to think about, like, how can I use this kite form, this kite object to sort of symbolize something else. And I was sort of wrestling with the idea for a while, and then I actually witnessed a ceremony that I started to visit for about maybe 7 years. Every Juneteenth, I would go to Coney Island and participate in the tribute to the ancestors ceremony, where people would come and they would play tribute to those people who basically perished in the Atlantic. And I wanted to do a piece that sort of would touch people, because that ceremony itself touched me. And so I started to experiment with the kite form as a symbol of transcendence, a symbol of almost going from one place to the next. So this was actually installed in an old spice factory in Brooklyn. And it was two components. It was a floor drawing that was connected to essentially a piece that was suspended in the air. And so you would sort of stand underneath these kites, about 5 of them, and sort of, witness this sort of trajectory, if you will, from ground to sky. And every piece that I do sort of adapts itself to each context that it's in. So this kite installation took another form when I had the opportunity to install it at the Hudson Valley Community College. And so this is the form that it took. And if you remembered from the Capoeira image, that sort of egg-shaped form, and these kites that are basically miniature, sort of flying towards this object, that itself symbolized the space between life and death, the space between here and there. So all that to sort of set the stage for what I'm doing now. So I'm working on, at the moment, maybe 3 different bodies of work, ciphers being one of them. Ciphers, which started out as a sort of experiment with trying to move beyond just having these images that were just this accumulation of different iconography that sort of created meaning to a single form. It came from my being exposed to these different African language systems that you saw in the earlier piece, School Days. And from that evolved these images where I started to use hair. And these were basically my kids here. So at a certain point in their lives, my kids had locks like I do, and decided that they no longer wanted to have locks. So of course, like any artist, I kept them. And I'm using them now to make work. So they started out being these very abstract, almost kind of Franz Klein references, but then evolved into a different type of images. So I started to almost, besides myself wanting to, started this juxtaposition again. So how do you create this image of the hair that in a sense, it's very, very simple. But then as you add other iconography to it, it becomes a bit more complicated. So here, if you think about it in a very practical way, it takes a certain time to grow. And so it's almost a representation of time because my hair, for example, have been growing for over 25 years. So there's 25 years of time attached to my head. Language is something that evolves over time and changes as it sort of impacts individuals, impact different cultural groups. And so I wanted to investigate how that happens and how I can create an image of my own, almost a language of my own, using hair as this sort of foundational object or reference. And it took different forms. Here, again, you see the cyanotype process almost creating this sort of watery kind of field. And then you have this sort of very direct image. And these are sort of works in progress, by the way. They're not finished yet. And then you have an image such as this, where I started again to sort of bring the portraiture back in, but using the hair in a very specific way. The image on the left, inside of that sort of circular form is an image of the galaxy, which you can't really see that clearly. Around the time I was doing this image, I had the wonderful opportunity to do a residency at the Center for Book Arts, and I see the two Center for Book Arts residents in the house as we speak. And this form that you see, these two forms actually grew out of that kite form. So if you imagine that central form in the middle with string and a tail attached to it, that's your typical Caribbean kite. And by extending each side out, I just created a six-pointed star with the hair forms that you see at the edges of it. And this is the installation at the Center for Book Arts. Another book in progress. So this is something that I haven't finished yet, but I'm actually in the process of making an accordion book, a large-scale accordion book, using the hair form as well. And then the work started getting very minimal. Like I started to reduce it to like just essential. Like I wanted to see how these images would look when they're nothing but hair on a white space and maybe 40 by 60 inches large, and sometimes even larger. And so they're very sort of deliberate, sort of structured forms. They're not sort of randomly placed like the first two that you saw. And here they are installed last year rather, at an exhibition in Newark at a place called Al Jarrah. And so cipher, I don't know where cipher will develop into. I don't know what it will become. I have some ideas, but at the moment I'm sort of just enjoying the fact that there are these sort of large-scale minimal images, minimal form that sort of occupy this white space. And when lit a certain way, almost seem to glow. There's another series of work that I'm working on currently, which happens to be probably one of the most difficult things that I've done because once again, I'm returning to this descriptive process. All digital, all color, documenting the island of Nevis, this rock as I described, and trying to, in a way, create this kind of same layer of meaning that I've done in my previous work, but sort of allowing the viewer themselves to sort of decipher it. So Nevis is this amazingly beautiful place. I mean, if you go, you can notice only the beauty. Many people have gone just to get married. They go, you get married, and you leave. But amidst this beauty is this very, very brutal legacy called slavery and colonialism that are still present, that are still sort of under the surface. People are friendly. I mean, it's everything that Caribbean nations tend to be. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of make these images that occupy the space between beauty and tragedy. But how do you let both of those things sort of coexist, maybe in an image, but also within the series itself? So the image on the left, basically, it's a monument that tells the story of the Nevisians who went to fight for Britain in World War II, for example, right? The image on the right is a main street that serves sometimes as a walk. This was a slave walk where you walk the slaves to market along this main road. And so these are things that are part of the history of this place, but are not very apparent. Someone wants to assassinate this guy, obviously. If you can see what it says on the left image. And then this is an image on the left, that same sugar mill photographed from inside. A very, very, you can't tell, but an absolutely, you can, if you're inside of the space, you can feel, you know, like the energy of what have gone on in that space. This image on the right is actually an old Sephardic Jewish cemetery, actually, that is actually well cared for because the descendants of those individuals come back and actually take care of the graves. And on the left, individuals who would come and bring their license plates from wherever they are in the United States and sort of leave it at this bar. Fisherman Pier, the traps that they take when they go out into the ocean, sometimes at 3 in the morning, and then come back, or at least sometimes at midnight and come back at 3 in the morning rather. And it's an unfinished and continuing series of work. And I've, like I said, really trying to come to terms with exactly, you know, how do I depict this very, very difficult subject? And how do the image, you know, sort of transcend this beauty that you cannot avoid and tell this other story? And I have only straight photography to do it with, because there's no manipulation. And probably right now my most enjoyable series of images are some images that I'm making of this individual who is the last surviving person, or at least the last person who chose to make charcoal the old way by stacking wood, covering it with vegetation, covering it with earth, and lighting it, waiting an hour to see it burn on one end. You watch the other end of the mound. Once you see smoke appear at the other end, you know that it's burning all the way through, and so you cover the whole thing. You watch it for another hour to make sure that it's still lit. Keep watching. You keep feeding the mound with more vegetation, more earth to slow down the burning process, because if you let it burn too quickly, it turns to ash. If you regulate the burning process, you get charcoal. Through a maybe 4 or 5 hour process of photographing him and talking to him, I found out that he was actually taught how to do this by my grandfather. And so I have this connection to this individual that it's one of celebration, but one of almost cautionary tale, if you will. It's not an issue on the island of Nevis because he's the only person cutting down trees, but it's a devastating problem in certain parts of the world where deforestation happens when you cut down trees and do not plant. So I'm caught in between celebrating what he's doing, but also mindful of the fact that this is something that do have the potential to sort of destroy the environment, or impact the environment in a very negative way. So this is the mound. Once it's covered and it's burning, it burns for 3 weeks. You uncover it, you get charcoal. You do it wrong, you get ash. Out of this will come another series that I would actually called Coleman, and it would be an homage to my grandfather. And this is the first image out of that series. It's a machete, one of the tools of the Coleman trade. It's a mango leaf roll-up print, and then the machete is finished with charcoal from that same site. So I'm going to be using the charcoal along with other processes to create this series of images about this individual. So hopefully that comes soon. Right, and that's the end.
Your work related to how to make charcoal, has it affected the continuation of it, where you come from? And two, will you still classify yourself as a photographer or an illustrator?
Actually, two good questions. So first, actually, I haven't shown the work in Nevis yet. I wish to. Actually, I've given him photographs. I've mailed him some photographs, and I plan to go back actually and document him again. But I'm not sure what kind of impact that the work has made, because I'm not sure whether he's shown those images to anyone. But I do intend to actually show that work in the Caribbean. That work itself actually was shown some of it was shown in Toronto, but it hasn't been to the Caribbean yet. I'm still a photographer. I think I will always be a photographer. I mean, I use the photographic process, but I also augment it with other media. But I still make images. I still make black and white images, I make color images. So one of the things that happens actually as a exhibiting artist is people sort of want certain works of yours, and so people have tended to want the mixed media more than the straight photographic work. And I'm hoping that that changes in the next few years, because I miss showing my photograph. I actually showed the Coleman images in Newark, and they were very well received, and I was very encouraged to sort of keep making them and keep showing photographs, because it's part of who I am. I mean, I see photographically. That's part of how my creative process organizes itself. It's always through the camera. I think my approach to the way the images themselves occupy space, as I said earlier, is because of my training as a graphic artist and my early training as a black and white photographer, studying with individuals who essentially were of the school of Cartier-Bresson and Walker Evans, and those guys who themselves were very, very formalist in terms of how they compose an image. And so I come out of that tradition, and that work comes out in my work, whether it's black and white or color. But I am a photographer.
I'm curious about the idea of the blueprint, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, particularly the significance of the high angle of view looking down. Tell us more about that process.
Yeah, so the blueprint, I mean, I love the color blue. The blueprint itself is just, for me, it's just an amazing color. And that series of work is actually my most literal. I mean, when you see it, I think most people get it. I mean, I think the other works is much more elusive. And I deliberately wanted to make a body of work that essentially spoke about those issues. And I thought the blueprint was a way of doing it, because, as I said, it comes from that tradition. That's first that scientific tradition in which it was used. Science is something to sort of examine things. The blueprint process, when it was used to render architectural drawing, it was about sort of creating structures in a very systematic way. And I wanted to make that connection, the conceptual connection between the blueprint, how it was used historically, and then now how these systems themselves perpetuate in a contemporary way. And the blueprint for me just kind of became a way to do that. In terms of the structures, now you're talking about the blueprint structures themselves, those other structures that are architectural, because I use some architectural structures outside of the blueprint process. But when I use them, it's almost to kind of create a different way of looking. So when you're used to looking down at a architectural structure. At least when you see an aerial drawing, you think of it as this way, but now I'm looking at it this way. And so it's this double perspective in this flat two-dimensional image that's very deliberate. And I was talking to you earlier, and I think I was saying that I wonder if part of that comes out of the fact that, like, when I work on the floor. And I tend to essentially lay my work on the floor and sort of walk around them. So I'm always looking down at the work the same way you would, almost as if you were sort of elevated, looking down. So it's an interesting way of thinking about how images organize themselves, but how they create themselves also from the perspective of the artist at the moment of interrogation and conception.
I'm Aaron. Thank you very much to present your work here. I really love it.
Thank you.
And I was majoring in printmaking major, so I kind of understand your work and you create things together.
Yes.
I sort of got a similar background as you. I was a graphic designer and I was a painter, and I really enjoy to do some creative work. So I got a question. I always lost myself in experimenting the different things. So I'm wondering, have you ever lost yourself in the process of experimenting the different types of subjects together?
You know, it actually is a good question, because the process is very seductive. I mean, when you're making these images, you can sometimes detour and make an image that's just about how the material is reacting to a surface. Like the blueprint that you saw, it was a blue image of a gentleman who seemed like he had his back turned to you, to the audience, and he was sort of looking out into the distance. That image was on vellum. And when I put it into the water, the cyanotype started to slip off the surface, and I pulled it out, and that's why I got the sort of watery, almost ethereal kind of effect. And that's what happens to the process. When you experiment, when you try the different materials and different surfaces, you do get seduced by the process, but you have to keep reminding yourself that there is something that you're trying to communicate. I had the great fortune of studying with Roy de Carava at Hunter College. And one of the things he always reminded me is not to get seduced by the process itself. Like, the process has to be a vehicle to investigate ideas. And that's why I'm very particular about communicating that this investigation of history and memory through these processes is supposed to be almost this sort of twinning, if you will. They're sort of looking at each other, over time. When I think of the cyanotype process, I mean, inevitably, I knew it was invented at a particular time in history. And so when I look at that particular time in history, I ask myself, well, so what were people of African descent doing in that time in history, right? When this process was created, what was happening in the world at that time? And so that process is always connected to this context of history. And for me, it's this constant reminder that keeps me grounded. And even though I get seduced by the process, I always sort of bring it back. And I think being seduced by the process isn't in itself a bad thing if you are exploring and if you are sort of learning something from those mistakes that you make, which really are opportunities to do things differently. But once again, just continually remind yourself that there's something more than the process that's involved with your engagement of what you're doing.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I was really impressed, but even more so I was impressed by that transformation we could witness in your work. It was, you started at point A and you ended at point B, and was like a constant transformation. And my question to you is, what was the guidance and what was the inspiration that led you through that amazing journey?
Yeah, I think it was, I hinted at it a bit. I mean, I guess I could talk about it a bit more, but it was that moment when I went back to the Caribbean for the first time after being here for 16 years. And realized that the single image, the single black and white image was incapable of translating that experience that I had, you know, standing in the Capitol and having someone who I have known all my life speak to me and have no idea who the person was. So once I realized I needed a different language for talking about that process of memory loss, if you will. So once I realized that the straight black and white image could not translate or transfer that experience, essentially I set about the process of acquiring these iconography that will then together start to create this narrative about memory and history, and how both those things come together to sort of, in a way, create new realities, but also new possibilities as well. So it was that moment, the moment of realizing that I could not communicate that particular experience with a black and white image.
I want to know did you follow your initial idea, or did your initial idea keep changing with the process? And another question is very important to me. I want to know if the vision comes first or the idea comes first, or how do you deal with it? Because sometimes I look at some type of visual in my mind. It's very blurry in my mind. I can't visualize it, but I know what I want to express. But when I'm doing it, the result is come out, well, it's not what I want to say in the initial. And then, but I sort of like this kind of image. So, so I'm just force an idea on this image. And I don't know if it's right or not. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, and I think most people who engage with the creative process at some point find themselves challenged by that. I think they both coexist, process and vision. Like, for me, I've gotten some of my best ideas just by working through, what I thought was a great idea, but then other things happen, other possibilities, other sort of detours that lead me somewhere else. So the only thing I can say is you have to keep engaging with the work. You have to keep making images, letting the work sort of speak to you and with each other. That's one of the reasons why I kind of lay my images on the floor, and I'm doing this constant motion where I'm wandering amongst them and letting them sort of communicate ideas, with me and to me. And then the broader investigation of the processes themselves add to that. So I don't think you necessarily, at least I don't get this sort of spark of imagination where I begin and work and then I finish it. For me, it's always the process. There are times when I would work on an image for 5 years. Sometimes it's 5 weeks. So the process is a continual, it's a continual one.
You've come a long way from your early beginnings as a photographer, involved into a very powerful graphic designer. So you've merged two different mediums. I was just wondering, the piece of the leaf, there was an image with a leaf with a man's face on it, which you used liquid light, and the background image is a drawing.
Yeah.
Have you had that published, like for its illustrations or commercial use? And I don't mean to be insulting, but I think any photographer would give his eye teeth to be as talented.
Can you repeat the question for the people in the back?
I think you.
Has your work been published commercially?
So
Those types of works.
okay. So the more graphic works.
More graphic works.
So I think the question is, are the more graphic works being published in a commercial context? Is that the question? And particularly, he's asking about the piece Jumbi, which was an image on leaf where the body was made out of charcoal. I haven't published it commercially, and I'm not really necessarily opposed to the work being seen in other spaces or other ways. Like for example, Blueprint have graced the cover of a textbook about the how France colonized the French-speaking African places. So yeah, I mean, people have approached me and actually, asked for the work to be seen in a different context. Sometimes I make that decision accordingly. I mean, someone has wanted to put Blueprint on T-shirts, right? So I'm not sure if I want to do that, but it's. But I understand. I totally understand the question. I think it's you have to. I sort of make those decisions based on sometimes the audience, but also how that work itself can fully impact an individual.
It's a very powerful image.
Yeah, thank you. And so for me, it's really not just about the commercial venture, but how the work itself touches the lives of people, which for me is far more important, I think.